What's up, YouTube? So today I want to talk about some of the upgrades and changes to my studio that I've been doing lately. I also want to talk about some of my favorite synths and hardware that's been keeping me busy, and something that's not quite synthy, but is a piece of hardware. Let's just put it that way. Thing that's been a source of really cool sounds for, granulars and all sorts of other stuff. So I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But yeah, so this is my studio tour video, and also a little bit of a celebration for reaching 50k subscribers. So thank you everyone for tuning into my videos, watching my videos, or subscribing to my channel, because that's, what got me to the 50k. Also, I just want to talk about some of my plans in terms of upgrades for the future, for my studio and for my channel and that kind of thing. So anyway, let's dive in and have a look. So over the past little while, I've kind of held off buying new synths and gear, and I've kind of been focusing my energy on my studio space. I've been concentrating a lot on both the aesthetic and the sound itself. I'm sure, as you guys can see, one of the biggest visual changes was, actually painting the walls, redoing the acoustics. So I've actually, what I've done there is I've put up panels of wood that I've mounted with a little airspace behind the acoustic panels. That actually increases the effectiveness of acoustic panels having a air gap, because that just kind of multiplies the amount of absorption that's happening. Essentially, an air gap is what decouples a sound source from its resonating material. But I'm not going to get too much into the technical side of things. Like I said, the main focus here was the aesthetics, because I guess last time I focused a lot on building the acoustic treatment and that kind of thing. So this time I really wanted to focus in on just making it look a lot better. So I've mounted LED panels. It didn't do too much of a good job, as you can see here. This corner over here, as you can see, is falling off. But, I kind of focused in more on the aesthetics. I don't know if you can see this rear wall over here, but I've actually painted that orange. Sometimes it probably looks a bit red in some of the videos. So I kind of went with like an accent wall and two colors that kind of are quite contrasting. These walls are kind of like a dark charcoal gray kind of color, and then the wall behind my setup, the wall that I actually look at, I've painted orange. So I didn't actually go with the Bitwig color scheme, for those who are probably like, oh my gosh, this guy's like a Bitwig fanboy now. It's quite different, but maybe in some photos it does kind of look a bit like the Bitwig color scheme, but that wasn't the main inspiration, or maybe subconsciously it was, who knows. So I also recently upgraded the lighting in my studio. I got myself one of these Elgato key lights. It's not cheap, it was pretty expensive, but to justify that, a lot of the lights here in South Africa, I think it's got to do with the fact that the cycle rate of our power system is different to USA and UK, for example. And often in video with cheaper lights, you can actually see them flickering, but it's not because of the light itself, it's because of the power source. So in for example, some videos would recommend, get this type of light for your videos, and I would order that light online and I would try it and it would flicker in my videos. But I believe it's because of the power system here in South Africa. But that's not linked to load shedding. I'm going to get into load shedding a little bit later on in the video, because it's not that relevant to all of you guys. But anyway, I'm going to discuss it just so you know what I'm going through and stuff. But yeah, so I upgraded the lighting. I got myself one of these Elgato key lights. I don't need the Wi-Fi features and all that kind of thing, but it's just one of the few lights that I read up about that actually works here locally. I know quite a few local streamers and video creators that use that here in South Africa with good results. I also managed to find 2 cheaper versions, but they're kind of like no-name brand type of things. So I've essentially got 3 lights kind of like around me, and that's the solution that I've kind of got at the moment. But like I said, it was one of those things where you have to try a few different lights until you find one that actually works, especially if you're in a country like myself whose power system is on a different refresh rate or whatever it's called. I'm not sure. I think we're on 50 hertz and everywhere else in the world is 60 hertz or the other way around. I'm not 100% sure about that, but that's what causes a lot of lights in videos here in South Africa or other places in the world to actually flicker. It's weird. Okay, so let's go through some of the synths in my rack over here. In my last studio video, I didn't actually go through my Euro rack because it was kind of still a work in progress. There was stuff that I was still unsure about. But I think I've got to the point now where I'm pretty happy with the system that I've got going. And I've got some workflows and stuff that I use quite regularly. So I haven't actually exchanged any modules in and out of the system for a couple of months now. Can you believe it? You know, I guess the whole stigma about the Eurorack or modular industry is that you just keep getting more modules, but that's not the case. I think when you're happy, you can actually kind of get down to business and start using the thing when you're happy with the workflow about it. But anyway, maybe that's just me. Let me, you know, if you're a modular person and you suffer from just buying new modules and never actually getting down to business, let me know in the comments as well, because maybe it is a thing. But so I'm sure some of you are quite curious about some of the modules in my system. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list them, show you a couple of B-rolls of myself using them, and play you some music over the background of myself actually just patching it, creating some weird sounds with the system. I guess you could say like the heart of the system, the thing that's generating most of the randomization and clock controls, is a module called Pamela's New Workout. By ALM. So this thing is insanely deep. You can do all sorts of weird Euclidean rhythms, random generations, sequences, and all sorts of things. It's a little bit menu divey. That being said, one thing I really love about it is you can kind of set it and forget it. So what I've done is I've basically set up the amount of outputs that I need for clocks in my system, and I just let that always do the clocks. And then I've got the amount of randoms that I need in the system, and that's kind of just always doing the randoms. And the outputs are kind of pre-assigned, and I don't do much configuration afterwards. Does that make sense? Sometimes I can jump in there and quickly change the tempo to suit what I'm doing, or change the divisions of each of the clock outputs, but that's about it in terms of the amount of menu diving that I do. I think the menu diving element is very much a set it and forget it type of thing. And I guess that's a similar thing to how I've set up the ornament and crime modules in my system, which is the next thing I want to talk about. So I have spoken about this module quite extensively on my channel, and in my current system I actually have 2 of them. One of them is running the alternative firmware called Hemispheres. And what that does is essentially splits the module into 2 modules that can kind of work either together or as their own individual modules, which is pretty insane. Each of those Hemispheres modes, each of the little modules that it splits into, has over 50 modes that you can load in there on the fly. So again, it can be a little bit menu divey, but most of the time I have it set up for a voltage offset, so I can either pitch stuff up or down octaves very quickly or create modulation on the fly. And the other one is another randomization. Sometimes I'll need an extra LFO or something like that, and I can just assign it quickly on the ornament and crime module. So it's a really, really versatile thing. And the other one I have in the traditional firmware, which has a couple of different modes to choose from. I believe the mode that I'm usually running is called Peaked, basically a quad envelope. And that handles all of the envelope type modulation that's happening in my patch. Just that one little ornament and crime module. It does all of the envelopes that I need. And one of the cool things about it is it's very visual. So on the screen you can actually see the shapes of the envelopes. It's a little bit menu divey again, like I said, but you know, what I've done is I've basically set it up into a kind of set it and forget it mode, where each of the 4 channels in the quad envelope is kind of set up slightly differently. So if I need an ADSR, I know I can go to channel like 3 or 4, and if I need more of a pluck or AD type of envelope, then I go to channels 1 and 2. So I kind of have set them up so I can patch them very quickly and get the most out of it. So super Swiss Army knife type of module. So the next module I want to talk about is called the Mind Phaser. So when this first came out, there was a very limited run, and unfortunately the company that actually designed the module Hex Inverter has subsequently closed down. But I've heard that another modular manufacturer, Erica Synths, will be reproducing the design of the Mind Phaser, which is pretty good news. So, I mean, we can wait to see if that actually happens, but it's an absolute sound design tone beast. It's kind of inspired by the Buchla complex oscillator, where it's essentially two oscillators. One can function as an LFO, but they're designed for cross modulation. So they're designed for FM, PM, and all sorts of funky things like that. There's also a wave folder built in. You can get some really crazy tones out of just the one module. So that's like the main analog oscillator source in the rack. All the other oscillator sources are digital. And I find, like, because it's such a versatile oscillator, I can get away with everything else, kind of all the other tone generations being digital, and my patches never sound too flat. There's kind of this diverse range because the digital oscillators sometimes offer you a lot more features packed into a much smaller box. So one example is something like wavetables. There's no such thing as wavetable in the analog domain. Wavetable is a very digital kind of concept. So just having wavetables in a patch is also another really powerful tool, as I'm sure you guys know from like Vital, Serum, Phase Plant, and all the like digital wavetable plugins. The next module I want to talk about is Plats or Plates. It was originally designed by Mutable Instruments. Mine is a clone, however. This is probably one of the biggest game changer concepts in synthesis in the last couple of years, because the reason I say that is because so many other companies have actually copied the design of all of the oscillators that are built in here. Minifreak, Microfreak by Arturia, the Dirtywave M8, which I'm going to get into a little bit later, and there's a couple of other Eurorack modules which have also kind of taken the concepts and the actual synth modes from Mutable Instruments Plats and used them in their own kind of designs. So it was a huge game changer in synthesis because it allowed for so many different types of synth modes in a very small form factor. So one example is just the fact that this module is capable of 8 different synth modes, 8 different drum modes, and it's less than half the size of the Mind Phaser, which is essentially just like a synth oscillator. The Plats also has built-in VCA, which is pretty insane, and all sorts of other really cool kind of stuff under the hood. It's also now recently had a firmware update which allows you to load DX7 patches onto it. So that just completely changes the game. I believe you can even write your own DX7 patches using a web browser application. So that opens up this very small form factor synthesizer into synth module into an 8 operator FM synth. Absolutely insane. So the next module in the rack is the Disting EX Alpha by Expert Sleepers. So this is another one of those really menu divey type of things. It's kind of like a 100 plus algorithms in one. Again, it's kind of 2 modules where it's split into 2, so you can have one side loaded with one algorithm and another side loaded with another algorithm. This one, I kind of usually just set it and forget it, where the one side is always loaded up with wavetables. I've got a bunch of stuff from Phase Plant, a bunch of stuff from Dada's side tables loaded up there, ready to go. And then the other side I've got as a variable filter, so it can be low pass, band pass, and high pass. The thing with that is the filter needs a little bit of extra voltage so that you can really fine tune it. And that's again going back to what I was saying with the ornament and crime, where that one is always set to the voltage output or attenuverter mode. So that helps me to send more modulation through to any of the other patches or any of the other modules if I need to. But say for example, if I'm doing a patch where I don't need that extra voice, it's got a bunch of effects built in there, bit crushers, vocoders, delays, reverbs, pretty much anything that you can think of, it's got that mode built in there. It's pretty insane. It's even got stuff where it can track the input and convert it to CV pitch output. So you can, for example, generate random tones with some kind of weird FM thing, send that into the input of the disting, and it'll automatically generate a melodic pitch output, which you can send through to a quantizer and create actual composed melodies out of noise, which is pretty interesting. But that's just kind of like one of the crazy examples of what you can do with just the disting alone. But it's such a diverse module. I know that quite a few YouTubers have done some really deep dives on it. Loopop's one on, I think that was the original disting MK4, where this is basically 2 distings in one, if that makes sense. So the next module is the G-Biz U-Dervish. It's a multi-effects, kind of focused more on delays and reverbs. This thing has some really nice sounding, lush, huge reverbs. So I kind of just always have it set to a reverb. If I need an extra reverb, I can just patch it in there, tweak the mix and some of the parameters in the reverb. But that's, again, one of those kind of set it and forget it modules. It's kind of like my dedicated reverb for my system. The next module that I want to talk about is the Make Noise Mimeophone. So I've got a little bit of a love-hate relationship with this module. It sounds really, really weird and great, and it's capable of some really cool sound designy things. Everything from dub delays or traditional echoes to car plus strong synthesis and to weird, almost granular-like sounds. But it's noisy. Even if you don't patch anything into it and you turn the dry wet all the way down, it runs the signal. It's not what they call true bypass. So the signal always goes through the chip in the module, whether you set it to dry wet or not. And I think maybe the chip that they've chosen, or whatever the case is, just happens to be noisy. So there's no way around it. If you're going to use that in a patch, there's just going to be a little bit of background hiss, which is not usually a problem. You know, with modular stuff, the levels are so dynamic that usually this tiny bit of noise doesn't really get too drastic. It's not too much of a problem. But when we start to send it into the computer and process it with distortions and that kind of thing, you can hear it. So it's just one of those things to take into account. I mean, if you are going to like take my word for it, you know, it is noisy. Maybe Make Noise is living up to their name. But that being said, there's a lot of their other stuff, so I've heard, doesn't have that background noise. So I guess maybe it was a conceptual choice in they wanted to make an analog sounding delay, and analog delays do have that background noise. It's unfortunate that there's not some way of turning it off or something like that. Maybe in a firmware update in the future we can see that, but it doesn't look like it from this point on. So the next two in the top right of the rack are kind of utility modules. The first one is a VCA. I generally use this to patch the Make Noise into the VCA so that I can actually turn the volumes down when I don't need them. And that way you don't have this background noise always running regardless of whether you have something being delayed or not. So that's the issue is, you know, often when you're using, for example, like delays and reverbs as a send effect, the output of the delay or the reverb is going to always be present unless you actually turn the mix down, turn the actual input on your mixer down. And so that's basically what that VCA is doing, is allowing me to turn the volume down after the delay when it's not being used, just so I don't get that noise throughout all patches all the time. Does that make sense? And then the next is the hex inverter mutant brain. So this basically just takes traditional MIDI input and converts it into 4 channels of CV or pitch data and 12 channels of trigger or gate data. So you can set this up. It's pretty configurable. You can set this up in various different ways. I believe at the moment, or how I generally have it set up, is actually in just 2 channels. So I have one channel which is sending pitch and velocity, which is also coming through as a CV value. So this allows me to create slightly more dynamic sequences and stuff like that. And the reason I've chosen to go with only 2 channels is because a lot of the time you only really need like the root note and a melody, and the other stuff can be done with sequencing and that kind of thing, sequencing of the gate data. So often I'll just have the root note on one of the channels and I'll use the velocities to play with different sequence of parameters within the patches. So that's how I deal with only 2 channels of MIDI data, but 4 voices in the synthesizer. So the next module that I want to talk about is the Hex Inverter Red Dragon. So this is a kind of traditional Polyvox style low-pass filter with a built-in drive. So this gets really gnarly at high resonance values. So this is more of a kind of noisy filter. If you want to do some kind of sound designy, weird, warbly stuff, this is fantastic for it. It's not as clinical and clean as something like the Ripples, which is the next module I'm going to talk about. The Ripples is really cool because this is a multi-mode filter. I had bought this literally just before Ripples 2 was released, which added the high pass. So the thing with Ripples 1 is you're limited to just 2 different types of low pass filter and a band pass filter, whereas Ripples 2 added the high pass filter output, which is really, really cool. So I may at some point switch out the Ripples for the Ripples 2, who knows. So the next module is the DivKid Mutes. So this thing is really, really cool. This is more of a performance module, but the way I generally set it up is so that it can send sounds through to all the different effect systems, kind of on the fly. So I generally have 1 or 2 sounds going into the different inputs, like 1 and maybe 3. And then what happens is input 2 gets normal to input 1, and then input 4 gets normal to input 3. So let's say we have 2 synth voices going into 1 and 3, and then we have the outputs going to different send effects. What that allows you to do is quickly send a tap of one of the hits through to the delay, and then through to the reverb, and through to a different effect. So you get some really playful sounds that are very dynamic because you're just sending quick bursts of the sounds through to all these different effects. So it's a very nice performative technique using that module. And one of the coolest things about it is you can either switch the switches over to the right and it toggles. If you switch the switches over to the left, they're momentary. So you could either just flick them over and kind of do quick little, almost like you can imagine a DJ scratching a crossfader, doing like just allowing quick bursts through to a sound with the momentary switch, or you can turn it on fully and allow something to go through to a reverb effect and to create more of a traditional reverb space in the mix. So a really nice performative tool that's actually so simple if you think about it. It's just inputs and outputs and mute switches. So the next module is the Mutable Instruments Veils. So this is a pretty simple quad VCA. One of the special things about this module is that the outputs are all normaled down to the next channel. So what that means is you could either use it as individual VCAs where each one has 4 outputs, or it doubles as a mixer. You could either use it as a 4-to-1 mixer, or a 2-to-2 mixer, or 3-and-1. It's kind of configurable. Again, really, really simple, but it's all in how you patch it, where you plug the things in that changes the functionality of the unit. And I really enjoy units like that because on the surface, they're really simple. They don't really take too much menu diving and understanding of the manual. It's very performative. You just plug it in. It's doing the thing. Okay, I understand how this works now. Does that make sense? So the next module is the Bitbox Micro by 1010 Music. I'm not going to dive too deep into this module, but I'm just going to say straight off the bat, it's probably one of the most complex modules in my system. It generally functions as, you can think of it as something like a very basic mini Ableton or mini Bitwig in the modular world, where you have little clips which you can launch and you can sequence loops and all sorts of things. But it's also a very advanced sampler, so you can run signals from other sources in your rack into it, sample them, loop them. It's even got built-in granular modes where you can re-trigger them with different amounts of voices, and you can scrub through the sample at different rates. You can trigger it with MIDI input, which it actually has mini jacks on the top, so you can plug in, for example, if you have like a little launch pad or something like that, you can just plug it straight in there, trigger the clips via the launch pad, or you can set it over to like chromatic mode, play your granular sounds like via a keyboard. It's super versatile. But most of the time, I generally set it up so that I have like a couple of loops going. So if I'm performing something and I get too deep in the weird sounds, I can always default back down to something that's just a groovy beat with a couple of other percussive loops and maybe a synth or something. So you can always kind of come back to something that's musically relevant, and it syncs to the other sources in your rack. So say, for example, if you have like a drum beat on a audio loop loaded up in the bitbox and you're sending it the same clock as your oscillators, you can use it as a source for a starting point for production in that way, which is incredibly powerful. Another really, really crazy thing about it is that when you save the files, they're saved as both like the file that you can load in other bitboxes, like the bigger bitbox and the smaller one, etc. But also it gives you a .alp, which you can load in Ableton. So say, for example, you're creating some sounds and you're just recording them into the bitbox. You can then save that as a project, pop the SD card into your computer, and it literally just opens up as an Ableton project. You don't have to do any conversions or anything like that. So it's a really nice way of sound designing and then getting those ideas into the computer without having to run it through interfaces and ADAT stuff to convert it and all sorts of stuff. It literally just records it straight in there. I believe it's 32-bit as well, which is really high quality. So the next thing is the Navigator by Acid Rain. So this is another one of those more performative type of things. I essentially usually just use it as a macro. So it's got a knob and a fader, and you can assign those to do whatever you want them to do. You can either run audio or modulation into it and use it as a kind of volume or amplitude modulator, like actual hardware control, or it's just normal to a 5-volt voltage. So you can use it to modulate anything else in the rack. It's really nice to have just one control that does a bunch of stuff in the rack. So say, for example, I do this a lot with the data bender. Because the data bender tends to get really complex, I like to just set up maybe 2 or 3 modulations going into it and just have one parameter to play with. And then that's enough control to get so much versatile sounds out of just that combo. And that's why I've actually got it right next to the data bender, is because the combo of those two is just such a powerful little... it's almost like having Infiltrator in your Euro rack. And so obviously that's the next module that I want to talk about, the Qubit Data Bender. So I guess the best way to explain this is that it emulates the different ways, or this is what it says in the manual. Don't quote me because it might be slightly off, but anyway, it says something along the lines of it emulates the different ways that electronic units can fail. So think CD skipping or glitches or buffer overriding and all sorts of weird stuff like that. This is the module that does all of that stuff, and it does it so well. One of my favorite things is that it's got this kind of this macro system built in where you can either turn it on, and each of the knobs does various different types of modulation. It's not just sweeping a value from 100% to minus 100%. At each different increment, it does different things. So with the pitch shift, for example, in the bottom half, it starts to reverse the sound. So that is incredibly cool because it gives you almost like granular-like sounds, but in hardware. So you can just feed it an input signal and reverse it. As the input is coming in, it kind of reverses it. So I like to send it something that's reverbed. So like a sine wave, pluck, or something like that. Send it through a reverb and then into that thing, and set it into that reverse mode, and it just gets these really lush ambient tones. But it's also everything from this lush ambient tones into really crazy complex textures and glitches. The next module is a very simple stereo mixer. I believe it's called the Nearness. Essentially, it's got a bunch of inputs, and as you patch them further out, it kind of pans the inputs like further out to the side. So you can, for example, patch one sound into different parts of the space. So it doesn't have any parameters or anything like that. It's just got inputs and output jacks. But it's such a versatile thing, especially for a system where you have the combination of mono signals with a combination of stereo signals, because you could have these raw synth oscillators coming through mono straight up front in the mix, then have these weird granular textures really spaced out to the sides. So you can get these really big sounding patches out of your modular system with this very simple 3U thing. And then the next module is the ST8, which is pretty funny because in Afrikaans, which is one of the local languages here in South Africa, 8 means out. I'm sure it's derived from Dutch. I'm sure the module, maybe the manufacturer is either Dutch or German. I'm sure that means out as well, because it's just an output module. One of the reasons why I chose this one specifically, though, is it's a balanced output. A lot of the other stuff that I've seen with modular is unbalanced. So that means if you're trying to record it into an actual audio interface, there tends to be some noise being introduced with an unbalanced signal. But with a balanced signal, there's you're much less likely to get noise unless you're using something like a mimeophone. Okay, so next I want to talk about one of my all-time favorites since the Roland SH-101. So it's a tough choice, I guess, between, like, in terms of my favorites, in terms of the 303 and the 101. Obviously, an original Roland 303 fetches a pretty penny, so I don't think I'll be getting one anytime soon, but I do have a clone of one which sounds pretty damn close to the original. The one thing about the 303 is it's not as much of a performative type of synthesizer. I think it's more of a groovebox type of sound, because the sound that it generates is quite simplistic. You know, you really have to process it to get some, you know, some different sounds from it. Whereas something like the SH-101 is capable of going from the sound that you know of it into something really different and really spacey, and then back very quickly, you know. So you can get these really complex sounds out of the 101 by just tweaking it and modulating it and playing it. Whereas with the 303, it's much more simple in terms of what it offers. There's no LFOs and that kind of thing. It's more about the traditional sound and the sequencing capabilities that it has. And that's what gives it that kind of traditional 303 sound, obviously. I guess there's trade-offs. The one thing about the 101 is you kind of have to learn it a little bit to be able to perform it as, to its best degree, because it's a pretty fixed architecture synthesizer. There's certain quirks about it, in certain things that you kind of have to learn how to play it to get the most out of it. Whereas the 303, you can kind of plug it in and it's always going to give you that 303 sound, you know what I mean? So the next thing I want to talk about, big shout out to Arturia, because they actually sent me this synth, is the Minifreak. So this is the next evolution of the Microfreak, which was one of my favorite synths, and I always said, it would be great if we got a Microfreak with some extra effects, or a Microfreak with two voices, two little digital oscillators built in there. And a lot of those things that I kind of always dreamed we would see in the next evolution of the Microfreak, we see in the Minifreak. And, say what you want about me being biased because they gave me the synth. The moment I saw it, I was sold on it. And not just the fact that I was already sold on the Microfreak, and it's most of the extras that I wanted to see in the next evolution of it. There's also a plug-in version that synchronizes with the hardware very, very seamlessly. So it's really nice to be able to create presets in the plugin, because you can get those really finicky details perfect, then put it onto the synthesizer, which you can then play either live or just play for fun, or whatever the case is. You can really get the best of both worlds with the combo of the software and the hardware that they offer with the Minifreak. Not to mention that it's just so fun to play. It's such a diverse sound engine in the oscillators, and one of them can actually be switched over to the same type of filter that we see in Pigments. So the combo of the Pigments filter, the analog filter, and all of the synthesizer modes that we see in the mutable plats, plus some more, it's just a killer synth. especially for the price. I mean, if you think about even, a MIDI controller of that size won't cost you much less than that. And it's solid build, really well kind of structured in terms of the architecture of the synthesizer, some really good sounding presets in there, and not to mention the software element where you can make your own presets, put them on, vice versa. You can make presets on the hardware, put them in the software to use them in tracks and that kind of thing. Really, really cool. So the next thing I want to talk about, again, big shout out to Arturia because they sent me this as well, is the Keystep Pro. And again, say what you want about me being biased, but it just fits into my system so perfectly. One of the things I really appreciate about the Keystep Pro is the fact that it's got individual outputs, both for the MIDI. So you got 2 MIDI outputs, and then you can assign those to any amount of channels that you need. Which is handy because not always you'll have a situation where you have a MIDI input and a MIDI through. So one example is in my Eurorack, the Mutant Brains is just a MIDI input. So having the 2 MIDIs allows me to send one MIDI input directly to the Eurorack, I can assign the channels however I want. The other MIDI input can basically go to my chain of fixed architecture synths. So it just makes the split so much easier because the Eurorack doesn't have the MIDI through. The fixed architecture synths do, but it's only the one that does. So you can go through the one into the next one, and from there, there's no through. So you can't create a full MIDI chain, and this is what it's like. You know, most synth setups, you'll get to a point where like one of the things in the chain doesn't have a through, or the output is delayed or something, and just having an extra MIDI output can just save the day like that. Not to mention the fact that it's got CV outputs and gate outputs as well. So for my archaic Roland SH-101, which doesn't actually have MIDI, I used to use a MIDI conversion box, which you'd send the MIDI input, it would require its own power, and then that converts it into CV and gate. Eventually, or subsequently, moved on from that and started using the Eurorack. Went through MIDI, converted it in the Eurorack space into CV and gate, and then sent that into the SH-101. But that then requires the Eurorack to be on and powered and patched to be able to use the SH-101. And so just having it in my MIDI controller, like my main sort of synth MIDI controller, direct CV outputs, hardware clock outputs, is just so versatile because every synth gets its own dedicated kind of channel in that regard. And it just allows a bit more free-form patching because I don't have to worry about patching the fixed architecture synths into the Eurorack. The Eurorack can kind of act as its own whole synth. Does that make sense? So these are all mounted on an on-stage keyboard stand. I can't remember the exact model number. I'll post it on the screen right now. I had to buy the original frame and then a couple of extra arms which you can then attach, which then add extra synths. So I think originally it's designed for like the bigger, you know, digital piano style synths because it just comes with 3 tiers, but you can just add the extra tiers on as long as you're within the maximum kilo thing per arm or per stand, then you know that should be good. I think I'm just about doing it, so I'm not going to add anything more synths to this particular rack. But it's a nice versatile system. You know, I can kind of change the angles of the synths if I need to at any point. You know, I felt like I had built myself a few desks in the past, and each time you do that, you're kind of fixed in the angles and that kind of thing. And then you start playing it and you're like, you know what? I actually want to change things around a little bit, and the desk is what it is. You can't really do too much swapping and changing. So having a system like this, especially in a more performance-based environment, just allows you to, you know, say for example, you play the one synth more with your left hand, but now you've put it on the right-hand side. These types of things you don't really know until you actually start playing the thing. Does that make sense? So I'm not sure how long ago it's been now since I actually built the desk, but I did build myself a new desk, since the last studio tour video. I wanted to go a lot more minimal with the studio. I wanted to have a lot less of the rack gear, because that kind of stuff I wasn't really using. I feel like a lot of the time when you see these really big studios, especially nowadays, a lot of that stuff is it's not being utilized as much as the space itself would inspire you to work. For example, like having space to put in something that you might use more of, like the weird box that I'm going to show you a little bit later on. I think those types of things are more invaluable, specifically maybe for myself, a sound designer. With the desk, I try to hide the audio interfaces and those kinds of things, because often I'm not touching that kind of stuff. Everything's already plugged in. I set my volumes in the software. And so there's no need for the audio interface to be on display and all these things to be out. So I tried to keep a lot of that stuff more minimal. And so a lot of those the audio interface and all those boxes are behind a screen, which I've mounted onto the desk. And then that screen either allows me to have a spectrum analyzer open if I'm producing, or if I'm streaming, it allows me to actually see the chat, or have a monitor of what's going on as an extra screen. And I think just something like that is more valuable than just having a cool looking box. Obviously, for Instagram and for the pictures, the cool gear looks cool, but I guess it's form versus function, and for me, I really try to go with function in terms of my really close space around me, and that allows me to take a synth, put it on the desk and play it if I need, because I've got the space on the desk. And then I focused more on the aesthetics, on the space around the desk, do you know what I mean? So the walls, the LEDs and all that kind of thing. I've also chosen to go a pretty minimal route in terms of the main MIDI controller that I use for my DAW. I use a very simple Arturia Micro Lab and a little DIY 4-knob MIDI controller that is just assigned to macros in synths. I mean, most of the time we're only ever using 2 knobs at a time, and with the complexity of VSTs or how DAWs work now, you can quickly assign that one knob to multiple parameters or macros or however you want. So I feel like, those massive MIDI controllers that we used to see back in the day with 32 knobs, you just get confused as to what knob is doing what most of the time. You have to actually look and see what's going on and what's going on. I feel like just having something much more simpler has actually made me use it more. And I also like the fact that I've chosen these bigger Moog style synth knobs, and those are easier to grip, so I can actually tweak the parameter by just poking it with my finger. So I can tweak all 4 parameters with my one hand. And I think stuff like that, again, is more valuable than a MIDI controller with 32 knobs, and you're only ever assigning the one to the cutoff and tweaking that, and then assigning it to something else and tweaking that to record in the automation. And so, yeah, that was really cool. It's a really simple build using the Arduino. For those who don't know what it is, I'm going to post some links in the description to where you can check out some content on how to build your own. Very, very simple. The thing has a USB. All you need to do is solder the knobs that you want to little wires, plug those into the Arduino, and you're good to go. Just load up the code that you can find online and set it up as a MIDI controller. Really, really cool. So the audio interface that I'm using is still a very old Focusrite Sapphire Pro 24. It's a Firewire interface, and in recent years they obviously don't release software updates for it anymore. I think Firewire itself is becoming a thing of the past. Been having quite a few issues with it and stuff, so I'm definitely needing to upgrade the audio interface. I've been looking at the Motu. I think it's the Pre-828. I think that's going to be perfect. There's actually a nice space in my rack over there. That's going to be the perfect size for it, and I think that's going to look so much cleaner because all the inputs can just go straight into the back. I can have a visual of the gains of each input directly on the front, as well as the outputs and stuff. I think just in terms of versatility and usability, I think that's going to upgrade the studio quite a bit. I used to have like an ADAT over here, and then all the synths would plug into the ADAT, and then I just found like it was just too much stuff in a small space. So I've just moved on to just plugging the synth in as I need it. But I'm thinking having everything plugged in, maybe an extra mic for when I have people here, streaming with me and producing and stuff. I can have an extra mic plugged in, always ready to go. So I think that's going to be a great addition to the studio. I'm also going to, probably sooner than the interface, going to upgrade my PC. It's about time. My PC is probably about over a decade old now. Older than that, actually. 3rd gen i7. So my PC is definitely due for an upgrade. And eventually, I will upgrade my monitors as well. Something much higher end. Something like PMC or Barefoot or... I don't know yet. We'll see what budget. I'm talking far future. But for the meantime, I've got, it's a relatively unknown brand, these yellow speakers over here. Relatively unknown brand, Eames Quartz. They do sound fantastic, super clinical, but they're also not very fatiguing. So often I find with monitors there's a kind of trade-off. Sometimes when they sound good, they're less clinical, they don't fatigue you as much. So I've always found there's a bit of a trade-off. Some monitors are really clinical, but you can only really produce on them for a couple of hours before you get you get ear fatigue very quickly. But then maybe monitors that sound a bit lusher don't fatigue as quick. So again, it's one of those trade-offs, and these were just fantastic. I found like they were very much in the middle of that. They're not too clinical to the point where you're fatiguing after a while, but also they sound really lush, and yeah, good trade-off. But anyway, I think, again, due for an upgrade. I've had them for a very, very long time. But I think that's something for the far future. I think the main thing that I'm focusing on right now is like a new PC and a new audio interface. So the next thing I want to talk about is this Wacom tablet. This is a drawing tablet. It's probably unsuspecting in a music studio, but I've seen a couple of other YouTubers talking about using them in their studios, specifically Matthias Holmgren. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But he even reckons that your posture is better when you're using a kind of pen as opposed to a mouse, because the mouse obviously puts strain on your elbow and that kind of thing. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know for sure, but I mean, we've had recent development in mouse technology now where they put the mouse on the side. Apparently that's better, who knows. But he reckons your posture is better when you're using the pen as well. But for me, I think it's more about a creative tool. Initially, I got it to help with my thumbnails, and I've also been diving into the world of Blender. For those who don't know what Blender is, it's really insane free 3D modeling software. I kind of been getting into the world of Blender, and having a pen tool obviously helps with that kind of thing. But also discovered that it's really cool for drawing modulations in Phase Plant or Bitwig, and even drawing wavetables. You can really quickly just scribble a new sound. So like, sometimes when I'm just stuck for creating a new tone, I'll literally just load up a wavetable, click new, open the editor, just scribble something in on the pad, and 9 times out of 10, it's already sparked some ideas and a new synth is going. So it's really, really cool tool for that. But, I wouldn't buy it specifically for just drawing wavetables, because, you could potentially just scribble it with a mouse or, that kind of thing. I guess it's more for the more technical stuff, like creating thumbnails, doing some 3D stuff as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Dirtywave M8. So this is probably one of my favorite groovebox/synth things that's come on the market in the past few years. Not only because it's just really crazy. It's so versatile and in such a small package, but also the project is moving very quickly. So we've already seen 3 firmware updates which have added kind of new modulation types, new synth modes, and all sorts of stuff. It's already got a bunch of synth modes derived from the Mutable Instruments Plats. It's got FM modes built in there. It's got a new chord mode and all sorts of other funky things. It's also got a really insane sampler, and just the whole sequencing system is built around the kind of more old school tracker. But I think that, people see that and it kind of sells it short. They don't understand how powerful it actually is. And on top of that, it's battery powered. So for myself, I live in South Africa and we have this thing called load shedding, which is like scheduled power outages. And, when the power goes out and I'm still feeling creative, I can just sit on this thing and create a little sequence or an ARP or, sample something and create a texture out of a sample, which I can then render out, load into my project when the power comes back on, and continue working. So it's a really nice, really versatile tool that is portable. So if you're, on the road a lot and you want to take something that you can still sketch out ideas, melodies, and all sorts of things, it's kind of like a little mini DAW in a box, because you can load samples, you can resample, you can load up all sorts of different synth modes. It's a little bit confusing at first if you don't understand how trackers work, but myself, recently I dived into Renoise, which is a tracker software. And so that was, for me, a little bit of a taste as to how the tracker system works, and I learned a lot diving into Renoise. So when I first picked up the M8, I was pretty fluent at it. Also understanding the Mutable Instruments Plats and all the synth modes that are built into that definitely did help to get really good sounds out really quickly. Also, just the construction of the thing and the choice of like the mechanical keys and very minimal kind of build is, I think, super expandable. A lot of people criticize this. How do you make music on something that's only got 8 buttons? And bear in mind, it's got MIDI input, so you can always plug a MIDI controller in there. It's got USB, so you can run your DAW in and out from it. It actually transfers the audio digitally via the USB, so there's no analog noise being introduced and stuff, which is another really cool benefit. You can also get some software, which it's like a patch for this thing called Touch Designer, which displays the screen of the unit on your computer. So another criticism that I've seen of the thing is that the screen is too small. But you could just, plug it into an external screen using that kind of system and do it that way. And for myself, when I stream, it's really cool to be able to show you guys what's going on the screen, because it's a little bit small to see through the camera and that kind of thing. So in case you missed the video that I did about this specific mic, this is a Lewitt LCT 440 Pure. I did recently upgrade the microphone situation in my videos as well. So this basically runs into an Arturia Minifuse 2. So I basically run 2 audio interfaces, and the reason why I do that is that I can have my own dedicated audio interface that runs straight into OBS for recording and for streaming, and a separate interface that runs in the DAW, because sometimes you'll have issues when the DAW is open and other software is trying to use the audio and that kind of thing. So just having a dedicated interface for that, I found, was a solution. It could have just been that, you know, again, the Sapphire Pro 24 is an archaic audio interface, and the drivers, you know, just break when too much is going on, but, you know, we'll see. Okay, so the last big thing that I want to talk about is this weird DIY contraption that I made. So this was inspired by a thing called the Apprehension Engine. So I'd seen this a few times before on YouTube, but recently Venus Theory made a video where he had built one as well, and that sparked a whole rabbit hole of me kind of investigating what this thing was, you know, where it came from, the original designs, and it's actually a really cool thing, originally conceived by an artist called Mark Corvin, who does horror movie scores, and him and a guitar manufacturer by the name of Tony Duggan Smith worked together to create the original Apprehension Engine, which they've now kind of turned into a brand. You can actually buy them online. They're a little bit expensive, you know, you could probably save a couple of bucks just making it yourself, but it's different, you know what I mean? You can see that the original Apprehension Engine is built like a high quality guitar, whereas my one, you can see it's built like a really bad clothing cabinet. It's that being said, is unique, and it's a sound that now I have that nobody else can replicate. And I think that's a truly special thing about this project, is now I feel like I have this one instrument that is my sound. You know what I mean? Nobody else can really replicate this exact sound, because you'd have to build this box the same. And I think that was a really fun project, both in learning a lot about how acoustic resonance works, you know, how different sounds vibrating on different surfaces creates these different tones. I learned a lot about string instruments, you know, how they work, how the vibration from the bow creates the tone, and all these types of things. So it was a really great project to really dive in. You know, some of the parts weren't that cheap, you know, buying the contact mics and the bows and the viola strings and some of that kind of stuff. It wasn't cheap, but it's still such a fun project. And if you compare it to a synthesizer, it's a very different ballpark, you know. So like I said, that's a hardware synth, that's a hardware store. Anyway, stupid joke. Out of all the synths that I have, you know, I really have so much fun getting lost in the world performing with this thing, because you can, there's no right or wrong way to play it. Does that make sense? Often with something that's based in the musical realm, with a keyboard or with guitar string. Okay, this has guitar strings, but you know what I mean. Something that's based in the musical world, you have this preconceived notion of how it needs to be played. You know, you'd think of a synth and you think immediately of keyboard, and now you're already thinking in this 12-tone chromatic scale, whereas there's so much other sound beyond that, in the textures and in these weird, like the way that the bow bounces off a metal ruler and all these types of things. And you know, one of the weirdest discoveries I made while playing with this thing is that a shot glass can kind of act as a phaser, or some kind of phaser, flanger, or formant filter type of thing. And I think it's due to the fact, like when you bow a surface and you run a shot glass across the surface, I think it's due to the fact that because it's round, the vibrations kind of like are all playing at different phases. And then, it's I don't know if it's definitely not making sense, but yeah, it's just these weird discoveries that you make that are like, I guess, more physical than synthesis. And these you can use in all sorts of weird sound design contexts, you know. Create a weird sound on this thing, load it up into Phase Plant's new granular engine, and it's an instant source of inspiration. Whereas sometimes with a synth, you kind of have to read the manual, learn how this thing goes. Like you've got to patch it, and you know, to get the most out of it. And then most importantly, actually be able to play the keys. Something that actually sounds good. So yeah, that's an important aspect. Okay. Anyway, I think I've blabbered on quite long. Probably wasted enough of your time that you could have spent doing something a bit more productive. So, yeah. Hopefully that's what you go do. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks again for subscribing, helping me to that big 50K. Now onwards and upwards to that 100K. I'll see you guys. I was about to say I'll see you guys there, but that's not true. I'll see you guys, sometime next week. But yeah, hopefully I will see you folks still here when we get there. That's what I wanted to say. Cheers. See you guys next time.